Now that we've wired up our post schema to our user model, we can add some tests to just see how subdocuments work with Mongoose. To make a new test file, I'm going to find my test directory, and then I'll make a new file called subdocument test. So inside of here, we'll put together a little bit of our boilerplate and then just kind of figure out exactly what it is we want to test inside of here. So we'll start off with our assert statement. We'll require in assert, and we'll also grab our user model. Next, we'll put in our describe statement, and I think a reasonable describe would be just subdocuments. So now, what do we really want to test here? What would be a reasonable first test? I think maybe just to start, we should start off by saying, kind of figure out how do we just create a subdocument and save it? How does that exactly work? So I'm going to make an it block, and we'll say it can create a subdocument. And we'll place our function, and before I forget, I'll add in my done callback. So inside this test, I want to try just creating a user with a nested post. I want to save it to my database, and then I want to fetch that record out and make sure that the post actually gets saved inside of there, and just kind of play around with it a little bit and see how it works. So inside the test, the first thing we need to do is create a user with a nested post. To do so, we'll make our favorite user Joe, say new user. We'll still give him a name of Joe. Now we need to add in our collection of posts, or our embedded list of posts inside this thing. To add in our posts, we don't really have to do anything special. We just have to pass in some amount of data that matches the structure that the user model expects. So what I mean by that is we need to pass in a key that points at a list or an array of records that match the schema of a post schema. If we then look at our post schema, which we just put together as well, we know that we know that our post schema requires just a title that should be a string. So in practice, we can just say, all right, Joe right here, he should have a post property, and that should point at a list of posts where each post is an object that has a title. So I'll give it a title of, what's a reasonable post title? How about just post title? That certainly works. Why not? So now I've got a little bit of a long line here. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of new lines just to make sure it's a little bit more legible. Okay, so that looks good right there. So in practice, creating new records with subdocuments is not the worst thing in the world. We can just keep on nesting as many properties as we would like inside this thing. Mongoose is going to see that we are providing a post property here, and it's going to automatically attempt to apply the post schema to this inner object right here. Note that when I say apply the post schema, what I really mean is that if we had written any validation into the post schema or any type of rules like that, that's where Mongoose would come into play and would start triggering some validation over the properties inside of this post right here. But right now we don't have any type of schema, so let's just save this thing and figure out how to work with it. When we have an embedded subdocument inside of an existing model, or an instance of a model to be precise, we can save the top level instance of the model, so in this case Joe, without any other special behavior. Nothing special here whatsoever. Still going to behave exactly the same as what we were doing before. In other words, all we have to do is call joe.save. Mongoose is going to recognize that we have an embedded list of posts here. It's going to automatically save everything inside of here as well. So we can say .then. And we're going to follow a similar testing strategy as we've seen previously, where we're going to save our model Joe. Then we will fetch Joe out of our database, and then we'll finally make an assertion about him. So we'll say user.find1. Let's just go ahead and find Joe. And then we could add on a chained .then, which will be called with a user. Notice I'm going to refer to user here as opposed to Joe. Just because we fetch the record that represents Joe out of our database does not mean that Joe automatically somehow magically gets updated. The user and Joe right here are, like, in theory the same thing, but they're completely separate objects. So inside of our test, we're going to make reference to user, which is returned by this find1 query, as opposed to referring to Joe. So now inside of here, we can make an assertion about the user that got returned. So what would be a reasonable assertion here? Well, we really just want to make sure that our record, Joe, can be saved with a subdocument. So I think that maybe a reasonable assertion would be to look at this user object that got returned and make sure that it has a post title property that is equal to post title. I think it's probably a reasonable assertion. So inside of here, we will look at the user. I expect the user to have a post property, which should be an array. Because it's an array, I want to pull out the first record that's inside there. So I'll say at 0. Oh, there we go, at 0. And on this first record, I want to grab the title property. And of course, that should be equal to post title. Okay, one last thing. Don't forget we need our done callback inside of here, that one little piece of magic. Okay, I think this looks good. Let's check out our terminal and see how our test is doing. All right, looks like we got 17 tests passing now. As usual, I'm going to just make sure that I can make this spec fail. I'm going to say that this should be equal to an empty string. So I'll save, and okay, nice, good error. That means that our test is running at least somewhat appropriately. Okay, cool. So as we've seen inside this section, whenever we save some amount of data to a user now, if we provide a post property, this will be automatically nested inside of the user. Now, we've embedded a post inside of a user, but this hasn't really gained us any special behavior just yet, right? Like, as I've said many times, we can arbitrarily add in other properties on a user model. There's no enforcement by my user schema on the properties that do or do not exist on the user model, except for the ones where I've added some validation. So what I mean by that is, we can add in as many arbitrary properties on here as we want. So I can add in ASDF equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever I want it to be. So what do we really gain by making this clear association between a user and a list of posts? Let's continue the next section and see how we can now make use of this subdocument idea to get a couple better properties or better features out of Mongoose. So let's continue the next section and see exactly how that works.